Tonight, let the hum of the modern world fade into the background. The light from your screen is already softening, your breath a little slower than before. You've tucked one arm under the pillow or perhaps curled your fingers just slightly. That's perfect. Because this is not a story to grip or chase, it is a story to drift inside of. And tonight, we begin far from where you are, not just in miles, but in centuries. Welcome to the lowlands and jungles of Mesoamerica. Long before noise, long before clocks, long before maps carved borders into land. The sky here is ink blue and wide. The stars don't blink. They burn steady like ancient watchfires. And beneath them, the world of the Maya. But this isn't a story of kings and blood. Not tonight. No pyramids, no warriors, no obsidian blades gleaming in sunrise. Instead, this is a quiet story. A story of sweetness, of stillness, of soft wings and silent messages. Because somewhere in this slow, breathing forest, a girl kneels beside a woven basket. Inside it, a bee. Not just any bee. Not the sharp buzzing kind you may know. This one is gentle, round, shimmering. Melipona, the sacred stingless bee of the Maya. She whispers something. A breath no louder than the wind, then opens the basket. The bee lifts into the morning air, spiraling like a dream. Somewhere, not far but not near, a boy is gathering wood. He pauses, turns his head, and smiles. You see, the Maya didn't just raise bees for honey. They believed that bees could carry more than pollen, that they could carry emotion, memory, even desire. They believed that a bee, fed on the right nectar, whispered to with the right words, could carry a message sweeter than any poem. And maybe, just maybe, love. So tonight, as you settle into your pillow and the fire crackles softly in your mind, we will follow them. Not just the Maya, but the bees. Through temples, through gardens, through time. We will trace the way a civilization once used wings instead of words, and honey instead of letters. You don't need to keep up. There is no test. This is not the kind of history that demands attention. Only breath. Only imagination. Only sleep. Let's begin. The Maya called them Zunan Kab, royal lady bees. And they were unlike any bees you know. Stingless, small, silent. They didn't buzz, they whispered. Their hives were not built in boxes, but hollow logs hung in shaded groves, tended like living scrolls by patient hands. They made a kind of honey so rare, so delicate, that it was reserved for medicine, rituals, and offerings. This was not honey for bread or tea. This was honey for gods, and sometimes for lovers. To the Maya, bees were not insects. They were emissaries, messengers between worlds. In the dense green shadow of the rainforest, where breath and mist curled together at dawn, bees were believed to carry the voices of the ancestors. The rustling in the leaves might be a jaguar, yes, but it might also be the spirit of a bee, returning with an answer. Their honey was used to anoint newborns, to heal wounds, to open the senses during sacred ceremonies. But there was something else too, something softer. A belief murmured from grandmother to granddaughter that a bee could carry a thought, a feeling, a longing. If you fed it right, held it gently, whispered just close enough to its wings, it would remember and fly. It said that a young woman could sit beside her hive and wait for a certain time of year, a season when the flowers open just so, when the scent in the air matched the one worn by her beloved. Then she would mix petals and honey and herbs into a tiny fragrant paste and place it near the hive, not inside, not forced, just nearby. She would breathe a wish, not aloud, of course, just in the still place behind her teeth, where feelings wait to become words. And if the bee accepted it, if the moment was right, it would fly away, quietly, softly, toward the one her heart leaned toward. No ink, no paper, no signature, just wings. It's a practice we can barely imagine now. A culture so patient it used time as a kind of ink. But to the Maya, this was not fantasy. It was science of the soul. A belief grounded not in chaos, but in deep observation. The bees knew more than we think, they said. They remembered paths. They tasted people. They followed feelings. And who are we to argue tonight, beneath the slow breath of this story? Let's lie still a little longer. Let the world slow. Let the bees hum low in your chest. Not from fear, but from memory. Not from wings, but from wonder. They are coming, and they carry something meant for you. The honey made by the melipona bees was unlike anything the Maya had tasted from the earth. It was thinner, yes, almost watery in its texture. But inside it lived layers of flavor, citrus, bark, warm wood, and something unnameable. Sweet, yes, but never cloying. It shimmered with a softness, like light seen through fabric. Some called it sunwater, others the breath of the forest. But more than taste, it held meaning. Honey was medicine, honey was poetry, and honey was love. In the Maya world, emotions were not private things buried deep in the chest. They were layered into everyday life, carved into walls, breathed into flowers, given shape through songs and food, and yes, through honey. To give someone honey was to say more than words aloud. To infuse a drop with intention was to send something powerful and unseen. Lovers would sometimes exchange honey pots instead of letters. Not large ones. Small, palm-sized vessels, painted with symbols only they understood. Inside, honey flavored with crushed petals or the smoke of a certain wood, chosen to remind the other of a shared moment. It was a quiet kind of language, spoken with scent and memory. And sometimes, the honey wasn't given by hand. Sometimes, it was given by wing. A bee that had been near you, that had tasted your skin, your clothes, the oils in your hair, could return to that memory. It might seek that scent again. And if the bee carried a trace of your breath, of your thought, of your longing, then maybe, just maybe, it would find its way to the person you missed. It wasn't magic. It wasn't superstition. It was devotion, wrapped in ritual. A patient kind of message sent not to impress, but to connect. There were gardens planted just for these bees, not for honey production, but for intention. Small flowers known to attract meliponas were arranged in certain patterns, each blossom a whisper, each breeze a possibility. A girl might walk through the garden barefoot before dawn, letting her steps crush petals gently, letting her presence infuse the path. Then she would leave, and the bees would begin their day. If one found her and followed her memory and touched another, that was a sign. The one who received the bee would know. This was a world where silence was not emptiness. It was language. Where sweetness was not flavor. It was feeling. So tonight, if the world outside your window feels a little quieter than usual, a little more still, maybe that's a bee in the dark, carrying something soft, something small, something like love. And maybe it's heading your way. In the world of the ancient Maya, romance did not announce itself with trumpets or grand declarations. It was subtle, layered. It drifted like smoke from copal resin, winding slowly through gardens and courtyards, taking its time. Love was not rushed. It was watched, tended, whispered. The Maya understood courtship not as conquest, but as harmony. Two lives tuning toward one another, slowly, like instruments aligning before a song. And in this culture, gestures meant everything. A glance could be a promise, a shared piece of fruit, a question, a well-placed feather, a confession. They used metaphors drawn from the natural world. A boy might call a girl the blossom that opens before the moon. A girl might describe a boy's voice as water that waits behind the stone. These were not pickup lines. They were tiny poems passed between hearts. And when it came to expressing affection, the Maya rarely spoke plainly. They placed symbols instead. A folded leaf tied with thread, a bit of cloth dyed with the colors of a sunrise, a bracelet of woven grasses tucked into a basket of maize. These were small acts, but they carried great weight. In the evenings, music drifted from stone patios, low flutes, turtle drums, a distant marimba made of hollowed wood and river stones. Couples didn't always dance. Sometimes they just sat close enough to share warmth, letting the silence hum between them like a second song. It was in these moments that bees often appeared, drawn to the blossoms in hair, to the honey-scented oils on skin. And so it became a symbol. If a bee visited you during an evening gathering, it meant someone had been thinking of you. If it landed on your hand and didn't sting, it meant your affection was returned. Some girls would gently stroke a bee and whisper into its wings. Others would simply wear a flower near the heart and wait. The Maya did not separate nature from emotion. They believed that love, like rain, followed patterns, that it required tending, that it could be carried, not in letters, but in pollen. Not through voices, but through vibration. And tonight, in the soft space between waking and dreaming, you are sitting among them. The fire is low. The night is warm. A clay cup of sweetened atole rests near your hand. Somewhere nearby, a song is beginning. Not loudly, just enough to feel. You look up, and from a flower's edge, a small wing stirs. A message is arriving. By now, the idea may seem natural to you, that a bee could carry a feeling, that a wing could deliver a thought. But for the Maya, it was more than metaphor. It was practice. And so we arrive at one of the quietest, most delicate customs in their world, the sending of honeyed messages. It began at dawn, not the loud kind of dawn, not the rooster and sunlight variety, but the slow, mist-draped kind. When dew still clung to leaves and the jungle exhaled in green silence, a young woman would wake before the birds, her hair still scented with last night's blossoms. She would not speak, not yet. Words might scatter the meaning. She would walk barefoot to the family hive, a hollow log nestled between stone and shade, where the melipona bees stirred inside like dreams in a bottle. She carried with her a tiny bowl, painted with the same symbols her grandmother had used, a spiral for longing, a shell for waiting, a crescent moon for quiet devotion. Inside the bowl, a blend, not just honey, but memory, ground petals from the path where she last saw him, crushed bark from the tree they once sat beneath, a trace of clay from the flute he carved for her, and of course, a drop of her own honey, produced in the family hive, flavored by the flowers of her village. She would stir it slowly with a sliver of wood, not to mix, but to awaken. Then she would place it at the mouth of the hive, gently enough not to frighten the bees. She would lean forward, whisper something only the bees would hear. Not a name, not a command, but a feeling shaped like breath. And then she would leave. Nothing dramatic, no spells, no signs. She would go about her day as if nothing had happened, weaving mats, washing gourds, laughing with her sister. But she would know, and the bees would know. And somewhere, a boy, maybe older, maybe younger, would pause in the middle of collecting water or smoothing pigment onto a wall. A bee would brush his cheek, then another. Perhaps it would land on his wrist. Perhaps he would smile. He would not speak either. He would simply nod once to the air, because the message had arrived. And if his heart agreed, he would do the same the next morning. A different blend, a different bowl, a different bee. This was not a practice of urgency. It was not for declarations or deadlines. It was a ritual of resonance. Two people tuning toward one another with patience through bees and breath. Tonight, as your own thoughts drift and tangle, as your body settles deeper into the softness of sleep, imagine the tiniest wings gliding across the night, not flapping, not rushing, but gliding, carrying something gentle, perhaps a memory, perhaps a promise, perhaps love. The Maya did not separate spirit from nature. For them, everything was alive with intention. The stones, the rivers, the trees, the wind, and especially the bees. Melipona bees, in particular, were seen as not just sacred, but spiritually intelligent. They weren't simply insects. They were carriers of essence, whisperers, listeners, returners. It was believed that if you whispered a memory into the wings of a bee and let it go without fear or force, it would remember where to carry that feeling. Not because it understood language, but because it moved through the same channels that thoughts and dreams traveled. Bees, they said, knew how to trace longing. Priests and spiritual guides, the Eiji Kiji, keepers of sacred time, often spoke to bees during their quiet rituals, not with commands, but with petitions. They didn't ask for messages to be delivered. They asked for alignment, that the heart of one would find the heart of another, through scent, through spirit, through wing. Some ceremonies were so subtle, so small, that even the participants weren't sure they had happened. A drop of honey left on a stone near the river, a braid of grass tied at the entrance to a hive, a flower crushed gently in the palm, then blown into the wind. And if a bee found you in the days that followed, the elders would say, "Someone has remembered you." In some villages, it was said that certain bees were reborn ancestors, that the grandmother who once wove your blankets might return as a golden shimmer near your window, that a father who never said goodbye might linger, silently circling your doorway until you looked up. And so, the bees were never swatted, never feared. If one landed on your finger, you waited. If it circled your ear, you listened. It might carry a story. It might carry forgiveness. It might carry love. To the Maya, the world was always sending you messages, if you were quiet enough to receive them. And tonight, as your breath slows and your eyes soften, you might imagine that too. That somewhere, in the quiet space just beyond the edge of sleep, a bee has lifted its wings. Not loudly, just enough. And it's flying toward someone you once loved. Or perhaps someone who still loves you in the shaded corners of Maya homes, where woven mats softened stone floors and the smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. Women prepared offerings for bees, not just with their hands, but with their hearts. It was a kind of quiet craft passed down through generations, not taught in words, but in gestures. A grandmother's hands guiding a child's, a mother's eyes watching the hive before speaking, a sister brushing crushed flowers from her palms onto a smooth bowl. The girls knew. If you rushed the ritual, the bees would not come. It was not a spell, not a superstition. It was trust, a rhythm, something like breath. You had to wait until the air felt right, still, but not stagnant, warm, but not pressing. You had to hear the hush between birdsong. You had to feel the moment where the day softened. Then, and only then, could you begin. They would sit by the hive in silence, sometimes alone, sometimes in a pair, sometimes with a curious younger sibling trailing behind, a bowl of honey in their lap. Nearby, sprigs of herbs, copal leaves, wild mint, petals from a flower that only opened after rain. With fingers sticky and slow, they would blend, not for taste, but for memory. The way he laughed when he dropped a gourd, the exact smell of his tunic after weaving in the dye house, the warmth of a look he didn't know she noticed. These were not things you could say aloud, but the bees would know. Then came the breath, a soft exhale just above the bowl, like blessing, like surrender. They didn't watch the bees fly. That was not the point. They returned inside, continued weaving, grinding maize, humming tunes from the last festival. But in their hearts, a thread had been pulled from them, through the air, to another. And if, days later, a bee circled the home and paused in the rafters, if it hovered near a freshly washed tunic or buzzed over a bowl of crushed cacao, the message was understood. No words exchanged, no letters written, just wings. The Maya did not need parchment to say, I remember. They did not need voices to whisper, I feel the same. The world itself became the letter, the bees, the ink. And tonight, as your pillow warms beneath your cheek and your limbs grow heavier, remember, not all messages need to be loud. Some arrive on the quietest wings. Some are sent with nothing but trust. Some are carried in honey. When the days grew longer and the air filled with the scent of blooming fruit trees, the Maya celebrated the turning of the season with rituals that danced between earth and sky. Spring was not just a time for planting crops. It was a time for planting intentions. And nowhere were those intentions more tender, more intricate than during the festivals of love and flowers. In small villages scattered across the Yucatan, people wove flower crowns with deliberate care, not merely for beauty, but for meaning. Every blossom had a voice. The bright orange of the marigold spoke of longing. Pale blue petals meant patience. A cluster of wild white flowers whispered of first affection. Girls and boys alike wore these symbols in their hair, letting the wind interpret what their mouths would not say. At the center of these gatherings stood the bee gardens, quiet corners filled with sacred plants known to draw the melipona bees. There, beneath woven canopies and paper banners that fluttered in the breeze, couples offered drops of honey on carved stones. They did not speak. They let the bees do the speaking. Children giggled as bees circled their flower crowns, thinking it luck. Elders nodded knowingly when a bee lingered too long on a girl's wrist. Somewhere between the music and the offerings, romance found its place, not loud or theatrical, but small, blooming, certain. And in these rituals, pettiness faded, jealousy softened. Under the wide spring sky, in the songs of wooden flutes, the heart had room to be simple, to trust a petal, to follow a wing. Couples exchanged not rings, but tiny honeycombs wrapped in cloth. Lovers gifted one another beeswax amulets shaped like hearts or spiral shells. And in the rarest, most delicate moments, a bee was given, not caught, but offered. Gently coaxed into a tiny gourd, its exit left open, a symbol of a love that could stay or go, a love that was trusted. The festivals were not extravagant. No fireworks, no fanfare, just soft dancing, slow meals, a hush that settled over the gathering when the bees became active, just as dusk began its descent. And as the first stars appeared, small, flickering, ancient, someone would sing the old song. The one about the bee that flew across 3 valleys to deliver a single thought. No one remembered all the verses, but everyone remembered the feeling. And maybe that's enough. Tonight, the hum of those bees hovers just beneath your thoughts. You're lying still, but your breath moves like flower-scented air. Somewhere in that space, between dream and memory, there's a tiny wing beat. It's not coming toward you. It's already here. They were more than beekeepers. The Maya priests who tended the melipona hives. They were timekeepers, word weavers, watchers of patterns both in the sky and in the hive. To raise bees was not simply to harvest honey. It was to observe something divine taking form again and again. These priests, clad in simple robes dyed with ash and rust, would rise with the sun to greet the bees, not with tools, but with breath. They'd exhale gently near the hive entrance, believing that the bees could sense intention, and intention, to the Maya, was everything. The hives themselves were sacred, hollow logs set horizontally, sealed at both ends with mud and wax, save for a small hole where bees could enter and leave. They were placed low to the ground in groves planted just for them, among flowering vines and wind-soft trees. Nearby sat small altars of stone and clay, with faded carvings and offerings laid atop, flower bundles, powdered copal, or bits of ripe fruit. These priests knew their bees by sound. A low, slow hum meant contentment. A sharp vibration signaled disturbance. A silence that stretched too long, that meant worry. They didn't rely on vision. They listened. And when the bees buzzed in a particular rhythm, the priest would lean in, nod once, and whisper a prayer in return. Some say the bees responded, not with speech, but with choice. A bee might land on a specific flower, or circle above a visitor's head, and the priest would know what that meant. He would relay the message quietly, never theatrically. "She is open to your offer," he might say. Or, "His heart has not softened." During rituals of connection, especially between young lovers or estranged family members, the priest would gently coax a bee from the hive, using a fragrant herb to guide its steps. He'd hold it cupped in both hands, warm and still. Then with eyes closed, he'd release it toward the sky. Where it went, that was the answer. This was not seen as superstition. It was seen as alignment. The belief that if 2 hearts were truly in tune, even a bee, small, quiet, unchorused, would find its way from one to the other. And if it didn't, then the priest would simply nod. "Not now," he'd whisper. "Not yet." No shame, no judgment, just the silence of waiting. Tonight, as your room darkens and the hush deepens around you, imagine a hive just outside your door, unseen, undisturbed. Inside, hundreds of tiny lives moving with purpose you can't quite see. And in the hands of someone who listens, one of those lives is being chosen. Not to sting, not to frighten, just to carry. To carry something you've almost forgotten you were still holding. There were no envelopes, no parchment, no wax seals. And yet, the Maya had a way of sending messages that lingered longer than ink. These were letters without letters, carried not by messengers, but by bees. The practice was simple on the surface, yet filled with layered meaning. A bee, having flown from one person's touch, from their honeyed hands, their oils, their scent, would sometimes land on another. It might circle their head during a conversation, or pause on the fabric near their heart. It might rest, without urgency, on the rim of a drinking bowl. And that, the Maya believed, was the reply. Not every bee was a messenger, but some were. You could tell by the way they moved, by the way they lingered, not just out of instinct, but as if they recognized something, a presence, a scent, a memory. To receive such a visit was to receive a kind of answer. If a girl sent a bee and it returned with pollen, nothing more, she waited. If days later, a different bee found her wearing the same flower behind her ear, she understood. He remembered. The bond had not faded. Some replies were clearer than others. A bee might land, then leave immediately. Rejection, perhaps. Another might stay, crawling slowly across the back of the hand. A quiet agreement. If two bees arrived together, it was seen as a sign of balance, of mutual affection, of two hearts aligned. There were even moments when lovers, separated by distance or duty, would send bees to one another through shared blossoms. A flower plucked and left by a doorway, dusted gently with honey. The bee would find it, and if it recognized the offering, it would stay. That was the message. I am still here. This form of communication required something that feels rare now, patience. There were no fast responses, no certainty, no delivery confirmation, only belief and hope, and perhaps most importantly, acceptance. Because not all bees returned. Some were lost to wind, to birds, to the unknown rhythms of the world, and that too was understood. Not every message was meant to arrive. Not every feeling needed an answer. But when it did arrive, quietly, gently, on a still afternoon or a moonlit night, it felt like the universe itself had nodded. Tonight, in your own stillness, you may feel something like that. The weightless sense that something, somewhere, heard you. Not in words, not in language, but in vibration, in timing, in trust. Close your eyes. Inhale. Somewhere, even now, a wing has turned toward you. In the soft gold of twilight, when the last rays of sun slid between temple stones, and the air smelled of warm soil and distant smoke, the Maya prepared for marriage. But their weddings were not performances. They were not meant for crowds or grand display. They were meant for balance, and at the center of many wedding rituals were bees. To the Maya, a union between two people was not a binding of ownership, but a merging of harmony, and no creature embodied harmony more than the melipona bee, who stung no one, who lived in quiet service, who built sweetness in darkness, patiently, without praise. When two people were to be married, their families would gather in the presence of a priest and a hive. Not just any hive, one chosen with care, whose bees had lived through a full cycle of seasons. A hive that understood time. In one tradition, the priest would gently touch each partner's hand to the hive. First her, then him. Not to be stung, but to be seen. To let the bees remember their scent, their rhythm. It was believed that if the bees accepted both, the union would last. Then came the ritual of the twin hives. 2 logs, one from each family's land, were placed side by side. If the bees from both hives crossed paths without conflict, if they hovered together over the same blossom or rested on the same stone, it was a blessing. A promise that these two lives could share space without disharmony. The couple would then exchange gifts. Not gold, not coins, but honeycombs. Pieces of their respective hives offered to one another, wrapped in cloth and tied with woven threads dyed in the colors of sunrise, orange for devotion, pink for affection, deep blue for patience. And finally, they would walk the garden path together, barefoot and in silence. Along the way, bees often circled around them. Not trained, not forced, just drawn. And each pass of a bee was seen as an agreement, as if the world itself was nodding gently. There were no loud cheers, no thunderous drums, only the sound of bees, the rustle of leaves, and two hearts learning how to beat in time. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to fade and your limbs grow heavy, you are walking that same path, slowly, without urgency. There are bees in the air, soft and unbothered. You feel no fear, only peace, only balance, and perhaps the quiet joining of something inside you, with something that's been waiting to be found. But not every story ends with harmony. Even in a world as gentle and symbolic as the Mayas, love carried risk. And with the bees, as with the heart, there were omens. Some believed that if a bee did not return, the message had been refused. Others whispered of darker meanings. A bee circling in restless spirals above a garden could signal doubt. A bee that landed but would not feed might be mourning. There were warnings too. If bees avoided a person's home entirely during the blooming season, it was said to be a sign of imbalance, a heart out of tune, or an affection not meant to grow. One of the oldest village tales spoke of a young man who had received a bee on his shoulder 3 nights in a row, and each time he ignored it. Too proud, too unsure. On the 4th night, the bees did not come. The girl who sent them married another. The young man lived a long life, but never again did a bee rest on his skin. It wasn't punishment, it was rhythm. The Maya believed that everything, even love, moved in cycles. Some cycles opened, some closed, but each had meaning. Superstitions surrounded bees that flew in at night. These were rare and regarded with awe. A bee arriving after dark was either a final goodbye or a last attempt. Either way, candles were lit, songs were sung in low tones, and a single drop of honey was left near the doorway, just in case. Some mothers taught their daughters to ask the bees a question when confused about a partner. They would sit at the edge of the hive and whisper 2 names, one after the other. Whichever name the bee stirred at first, that was the answer. Even in endings, the bees were gentle. They never shouted. They never judged. But they always spoke. And when the heart was broken, the Maya turned again to the hives. They offered honey to the gods. They burned herbs to cleanse memory. They washed their hands in flower water and sat quietly beside the bees, waiting for the day when their wings would carry hope again. Because the Maya understood what many of us forget, that love, like bees, must be free, that not every journey leads to arrival, that sometimes the message is not a yes, but a soft no. And that's okay, because even unreturned bees carried intention. Even lost messages left sweetness behind. So tonight, if something within you aches or lingers unanswered, breathe. Let it hover. Let it move like a bee into the soft distance. Not forgotten, just free. Among the many stories the Maya passed from mouth to mouth, there was one that survived the longest, told in whispers at dusk, just as the last bees disappeared into their hives. It was the tale of Balaam and Ixchel, the boy and the girl, the bee and the blossom. They say Balaam was a quiet youth, not shy, exactly, but careful. He carved flutes from river reeds and painted clay jars with scenes of birds and stars. And though many noticed his clever hands, only one ever captured his heart, Ixchel, the weaver's daughter, whose laughter sounded like rain and whose braids smelled of wild vanilla. But he never spoke to her, not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. Instead, Balaam began visiting the hives, not to collect honey, but to watch. He'd sit near the sacred melipona logs and listen to their hum, whispering his thoughts into the air. He carved a tiny figure of Ixchel from soft wood and set it near the hive. Then one morning, he took a handful of crushed blossoms, mixed them with a drop of honey, and placed it in a painted bowl by the entrance. The bees circled. One landed and flew. On the other side of the village, as Ixchel was weaving by the doorway, a single bee landed on her shoulder. She turned her head and smiled, though she wasn't sure why. That night, she dreamt of stars shaped like wings. The next morning, she walked to the hive. Quietly, she placed a blossom from her braid into the same bowl, said nothing, walked away. The bees flew again. This continued for weeks. Not a word passed between them. Only bees. Only silence. Only the slow, unseen weaving of affection. Then came the great storm. Winds tore through the village, ripping roofs and trees alike. Many hives were lost. But Balaam, fearing for the sacred bees, ran into the forest and found the hive still standing. Barely. He knelt in the rain, shielding it with his own body, until the storm passed. When Ixchel found him the next day, soaked, shivering, but smiling, she said nothing. She simply took his hand, and the bees flew around them both. Some say Balaam never married anyone but her. Others say he became a priest of the hives, speaking to bees until his final breath. But all agree, the bees still remember their story. If you see two meliponas dancing near a blossom in the shape of a heart, that's them, still sending their love, one wing beat at a time. And tonight, as you rest your own heart, heavy or light, remember, love need not be loud. It can be whispered. It can be carved. It can be carried on wings, no larger than a thumbnail, and still arrive full of truth. Close your eyes. Let the hum of that legend carry you. You are safe. You are still. And perhaps, even now, a bee dreams of you. Time, as the Maya knew well, moves in circles. Seasons return. Stars realign. Even forgotten things have a way of blooming again. And so, like petals that fall only to be reborn, the bee rituals of love did not vanish all at once. They faded, gently, like breath on a mirror. With the coming of change, of conquests, of new gods, of foreign calendars and foreign words, much of the old world was buried beneath stone and silence. Temples crumbled. Priests disappeared. Melipona hives were replaced by imported bees, more efficient but less sacred. Honey was sold, not sung over. Bees were tools, not messengers. And yet, in the smallest villages, tucked between forests and forgotten roads, the whispers remained. A grandmother who leaves a bowl of sweet water near the hive every spring. A boy who tells his little sister to watch where the bees land when she has a secret. A girl who believes that if a bee lands on her finger, someone she misses is thinking of her. These are not ceremonies now. They are habits, echoes, but echoes still carry the shape of the song. Anthropologists, when they come with notebooks and recorders, sometimes hear strange stories. A woman in Yucatan who swears she met her husband because a bee followed her to the market 3 days in a row. A healer who says the melipona are not just pollinators, they are reminders. Even the hives, long thought to be obsolete, are making a quiet return. Artisans now carve log hives once more. The bees are being reintroduced, carefully, by those who believe they never truly left, just slept, just waited. And in temples, where weather has softened once hard carvings, some glyphs remain, barely visible, almost erased, of bees flying between hearts, of honey dripping between outstretched hands, of wings curved like crescent moons. The message is still here, faint but present, because some truths are too tender to disappear. And maybe that's why, tonight, even in your room, surrounded by things the Maya could not imagine, electricity, headphones, distant satellites blinking far above, there's still space for this story, for the idea that a thought can travel without words, that a feeling can take flight without noise, that the love you once sent out into the world might still be circling back, on wings so small you can only feel them in dreams. There is a word in the old Maya language, tun, which means something like the stone that lives quietly in the forest. It refers to the presence of something solid, ancient, unshaken by the passing world around it. Some said the hearts of bees were like that, and some said love was too. As Wu Zetian ruled in silence, and emperors carved their names in pillars, the Maya left no grand inscriptions about how bees carried their feelings. There are no monuments, no loud proclamations, just soft stories, drifting through time like smoke from copal. In the final years of one's life, they said, you would begin to dream more of bees, of flowers you once offered, and messages you never knew if they arrived, of faces that blurred into mist, but left behind a warmth you couldn't explain. The elderly, especially the women, would sit near the hives not for honey, but for memory. They would hum old songs, softly, so as not to disturb the bees. Sometimes they would place a petal or two in the offering bowls, not for romance anymore, just to remember what it felt like to hope. A few believed that when the soul leaves the body, it becomes a bee for one final flight, one last journey, to say what was never said, to visit the hands it once held, to land on the shoulder of someone still grieving, and then to vanish. And so, at funerals, bowls of honey were left at the grave, not for the dead, but for the bees. Tonight, this story folds itself around you like the petal of a flower closing for the night. The hive hums softly in your thoughts. The garden grows dim, the wings slow. You do not need to remember everything. The bees will. You do not need to send a message. One is already on its way. You do not need to hold on. Just rest. Let the world turn like a hive in harmony. Let your breath fall into its rhythm. You are loved. You are remembered. And somewhere, just outside the edge of waking, a bee moves gently through the dark, carrying the last of your thoughts to someone who still dreams of you. Night has settled fully now, soft as the down of an owl's wing. The stories have drifted like incense through the chambers of your mind, curling around memories, easing the edges of thought. You have walked shadow-lit gardens where bees hummed secret messages, watched lovers trust wings instead of words, and felt time slow to the gentle rhythm of chrysanthemum petals falling on ancient stone. So, breathe in once more, slowly, and let the scent of distant blossoms fill your chest. Hold it for the length of a heartbeat. Exhale and feel the hive-like buzz of the day fade into a single quiet note. In this hush, you need do nothing. The world will turn without your worry. The stars will keep their courses. The bees will keep their paths. And somewhere, in a place beyond clocks and calendars, the tender intentions you have carried will find their flight. If thoughts return, greet them like friendly bees. Acknowledge the hum, then let them drift away toward dusk blue horizons. Trust that they will land where they are needed. Trust that in silence, work is still being done. Sweet honey, gathered drop by drop. Feelings translated into golden light. Feel your limbs sink deeper, as though the bed beneath you were soft earth, holding and renewing you. Let gratitude settle like warm honey in your throat. Gratitude for stories whispered through centuries, for love that survives on wings, for a night that promises rest. And should you sense the faintest flutter on the edge of dream, a pair of invisible wings brushing past, know that it is only the universe reminding you. You are heard, you are remembered, you are enough. Now close your eyes. The hive is quiet, the garden sleeps, and you, gentle listener, are ready to follow. Good night.